January 1861. 6 weeks before Abraham Lincoln leaves for his own inauguration, a letter reaches him from Illinois. It concerns his stepmother, Sarah Bush Lincoln, the woman who raised him after his birth mother died. The letter says she is afraid. Not for the country. For him. She believes his political enemies are going to kill him. Sarah Bush Lincoln cannot read. She cannot write. And 4 years before John Wilkes Booth fires the shot that proves her right, this illiterate frontier widow has already decided her stepson will not survive the presidency. No one asked how she knew. No one asked what 46 years spent raising another woman's son had cost her, or why an old widow buried on a farm in Coles County, Illinois, could see what a divided nation refused to say out loud. History remembers Abraham Lincoln. It barely remembers the woman who made him. This is her story. Ask anyone to name Abraham Lincoln's mother, and they'll say Nancy Hanks. Correctly. Nancy died in 1818, poisoned by milk from a cow that had grazed on white snake root, somewhere in the Indiana wilderness. Abraham was 9. Her death is one of the fixed points of the Lincoln legend: the fever, the log cabin, the boy left motherless. Ask the same person to name the woman who raised him for the next 46 years, and most will draw a blank. She was not his mother by blood. She married his father a year after Nancy died. She could not read the books she gave him. She left no diary, no letters in her own hand, no portrait commissioned in her prime, because she could not write, and no one thought to paint a farmer's wife. Almost everything known about her survives because a grieving lawyer, desperate to understand a murdered president, tracked down an old woman in Illinois and asked her to talk before she died too. Her name was Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln. History filed her under a single word: stepmother, a word that has carried the same poisoned undertone for centuries. The interloper, the replacement, the one who could never measure up to what was lost. That is the story fairy tales tell about women like her. It is not the story the record tells. Consider the odds against her being remembered kindly at all. On the American frontier in 1819, a second wife arriving into a dead woman's household was, more often than not, a source of friction, a rival claim on a father's attention, a stranger enforcing new rules on children who had already lost enough. Court records and diaries from the period are full of exactly that tension. Sarah Bush Lincoln is the exception the historical record keeps producing from nearly every direction it is asked. What the record describes instead is rarer: a woman with no blood tie to a child, no legal obligation, no social penalty waiting for her if she had simply kept her distance, who instead gave a broken 9-year-old boy a floor to sleep on, clothes that fit, and permission to want more than the farm around him. She had no way of knowing she was raising a president. She was raising a stepson. That distinction is the entire story. Everything that follows has to be reconstructed the same way, second-hand, decades late, filtered through the memory of people who had every reason to romanticize a dead president's childhood. That is not a flaw this film can fix. It is simply the condition Sarah Bush Lincoln's entire legacy exists under, remembered only because someone finally thought her memories were worth writing down. Sarah Bush was born December 13, 1788, in Hardin County, Kentucky, one of 9 children belonging to Christopher and Hannah Bush. Her father owned more than 2,000 acres and worked as a slave patrol captain, a fact the record does not soften, and this film will not either. By the standards of the Kentucky frontier, Sarah was born into relative comfort. Nothing in her childhood predicted the jailhouse, the widowhood, or the cabin in Indiana that was waiting for her. When Sarah was 2, the family moved to Elizabethtown. It was there, as a girl, that she first crossed paths with a young couple named Thomas and Nancy Lincoln, a coincidence that would take 13 more years, 2 dead spouses, and 1 blunt proposal to matter. She married Daniel Johnston in 1806, at 17, and comfort ended there. The Johnstons carried debt for most of their years together, debt Daniel's own brothers periodically had to cover. In 1814, Daniel took the one job available to a man with nothing, county jailer. The position came with living quarters inside the jailhouse itself. Sarah became, in practice, the jail's cook and cleaner, and took on cleaning work at the courthouse besides. This is not a woman who fell from privilege into hardship once. She spent her 20s scrubbing a jail floor to keep her children fed, in a marriage that never once let her rest. Widowhood in this period rarely came with a safety net. A woman without inherited property of her own depended almost entirely on her ability to manage what her husband left behind, or to remarry into someone else's. Then, in 1816, cholera moved through the region and took Daniel with it. Sarah was 27, widowed, with 3 children, John, Elizabeth, Matilda, and no income at all. What she did next complicates any easy story about her as a victim. She rebuilt. She bought a cabin, furnished it well enough that neighbors called it luxurious for the setting, and sent one of her daughters to a private school, an extraordinary expense for a widow of her means. Historian Charles Coleman would later title his biography of her "The Mother Who Survived Him," and the phrase fits both ends of her life. She had already survived one husband. She had already rebuilt once, alone, with nothing but her own management to work with, before Thomas Lincoln ever rode back into town. By 1819, she was no longer the girl he had known back in Elizabethtown. She was a woman who had buried a husband, run a household of children alone, negotiated her own debts, and put one daughter through private schooling, all without a man's name attached to any of it. Whatever Thomas Lincoln needed when he came looking, he was not marrying a stranger, and he was not rescuing a helpless widow. He was marrying someone who had already proven, without him, that she could hold a household together while everything around it fell apart. That is the woman Thomas Lincoln came looking for. Nancy Hanks Lincoln died in October 1818. Thomas Lincoln, left with 2 children and a household collapsing around him on the Indiana frontier, rode back to Elizabethtown, back to the town of his own boyhood, back to a widow he had known since she was a girl. His proposal, according to accounts collected decades later, was not courtship. It was closer to an inventory. He had no wife, she had no husband, they had known each other since childhood, and he saw no reason to waste time discussing it further. There was no longing in it. There were 2 grieving people with children to feed, striking a practical arrangement in a world that offered widows and widowers almost no other options. Before the wedding, Thomas paid off Sarah's remaining debts from Daniel Johnston's estate. That detail is easy to skip past. It shouldn't be. It meant Sarah did not walk into this marriage as an equal negotiating partner. She walked in as a woman whose freedom from debt had just become something her new husband owned. They married December 2, 1819, in a log house on Main Street, Elizabethtown. Sarah was 31. Thomas was 10 years older. Neither ever described the marriage in romantic terms, in any surviving account. What they described, when they described it at all, was necessity. Nothing in 1819 legally required Thomas Lincoln to love, house, or protect the 2 children Nancy had left behind. That obligation existed nowhere but in the unwritten expectation that Sarah, the moment she said yes, would simply take it on. No contract specified it. There was only the fact that she showed up, and stayed, for a boy she had not yet even met. Thomas brought Sarah and her 3 children, ranging roughly 9 to 13, to his farm in Spencer County, Indiana. Waiting there were his own 2 surviving children, 11-year-old Sarah and 9-year-old Abraham. A cousin, 20-year-old Dennis Hanks, lived there too. Overnight, a 2-room cabin built for grief became home to 8 people, 3 beds, and 1 woman who had walked into it a stranger to almost everyone inside. What Sarah found, by her own account to Herndon decades later, was a country she remembered as untamed and empty, and a household to match it. It was not just an unfamiliar family. It was a household quietly falling apart. The children had spent months largely unsupervised while Thomas worked. Her response was immediate and physical, not sentimental. She brought furniture from Kentucky, including a $45 bureau that would have looked out of place in most frontier cabins. She insisted on a wooden floor. She had a loft built for the boys, reached by pegs driven into the log wall like ladder rungs. The beds themselves were built from poles and clapboards, makeshift furniture unlike anything still in use by the time she described it, decades later, to a lawyer taking notes in her farmhouse. And she washed and dressed Abraham and his sister until, in her own words, they looked more human. That phrase is not warm. It is not sentimental. It is a woman looking plainly at two neglected children and doing the unglamorous work of restoring them, because someone had to, and she decided it would be her. There was warmth underneath the discipline, too, and it survives in the smallest details. Years later, when Abraham stood 6'4" and could barely clear the farmhouse ceiling with his own head, he and a group of younger boys once smeared mud on their bare feet and walked them, upside down, across Sarah's clean ceiling as a joke. When she found the footprints, Lincoln recalled, she did not rage. She laughed and threatened, without any real intention, to spank him. Nothing legally required Sarah to treat Nancy's children as her own. Blended households were common on a frontier defined by early death, and stepmothers of the period were under no real obligation to extend themselves past minimum care. What survives, consistently, across nearly every account of that household, is that she did extend herself, and that in a body of Lincoln literature soaked in controversy over nearly every other figure in his life, there is hardly one unkind word written about her. Sarah Bush Lincoln could not read a single word. That fact sits at the center of what makes her role in Abraham's education so strange and so consequential. Among her belongings when she arrived in Indiana were several books, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, a volume on Sinbad the Sailor, a copy of Webster's Speller. She handed them to a stepson she barely knew. She could not check a single sentence he read. What she recognized and protected was his hunger for it. He read everything he could find, and when he hit a passage that struck him and had no paper, he wrote it on a wooden board, then shaved the board clean with a drawing knife when it filled up, so he could start again. He kept a scrapbook of what mattered to him. He worked his arithmetic the same way, on boards, in charcoal, erasing and starting over, because paper on the Indiana frontier was a luxury a farming family did not have. He would come home from church and re-preach the sermon, word for word, to the other children, standing on a stump, a performance his father eventually had to shut down because Abraham would abandon his own chores to deliver it, and pull the other children off their work too. Sarah, asked decades later what kind of boy he had been, did not hedge. He was, she said without qualification, the best boy she had ever known, not the most obedient, not the most useful on a farm that needed hands more than minds, but the one most determined to become something the frontier around him had never asked him to be. Here the record splits, and this film will not smooth it over. Sarah herself, interviewed as an old woman, insisted her husband never pulled Abraham away from reading if it could be helped, that Thomas, illiterate himself, understood exactly what his son was reaching for and largely let him reach. Other historians who have studied the same evidence read it differently, arguing that Thomas resented the reading, saw it as stolen labor a subsistence farm could not afford to lose, and that the friction between father and son over exactly this question shaped the rest of their relationship. Some Lincoln scholars go further still, arguing that the popular image of Thomas as a hostile, resentful failure of a father was manufactured after the fact, that as Abraham was elevated to near mythic status following his assassination, his father was pushed down to make room for the myth, cast as the obstacle the great man had to overcome rather than a man doing his difficult best on a hard frontier. Neither reading can be proven outright. Both rely on memory gathered decades after the fact, filtered through very different relationships with a dead man. What can be established, without dispute, is Sarah's own position, stated on the record late in her life. She did not stand in his way. And by her account, neither did her husband. What is not contested at all is what she told Lincoln's law partner about their bond. Their minds, she said, seemed to run together, moved in the same channel. He never once gave her a cross word, she said, and she never gave him one back. For the rest of his life, he called her mother. If a story like this one, a life large enough to shape history, quiet enough to nearly vanish from it, feels worth knowing, this channel exists to keep finding them. There will be more. In 1830, the family moved again to Macon County, Illinois, chasing the same hope for better land that had driven most of Thomas Lincoln's life. Abraham, 21, made the trip with them, and within the year, did what young men on the frontier were expected to do. He left. From here, the relationship between Sarah and her stepson exists mostly in the space between visits. Lincoln built a career in New Salem, then Springfield, studied law, entered politics, married, started a family. He did not vanish. He stayed in contact, and later stepped in to help save the Coles County land from forced sale, a debt crisis caused not by Sarah, but by her biological son, John Johnson, whose chronic idleness Lincoln addressed with a bluntness he almost never showed his stepmother. In one surviving letter, Lincoln drew a sharp distinction between laziness and something he considered worse, a grown man capable of work who simply refused to do any, and hadn't, by Lincoln's own reckoning, put in a genuine day's labor in longer than he cared to specify. Any help Lincoln offered came tied to actual effort, not sympathy. It is a striking contrast. The tenderness Lincoln extended to the woman with no blood claim on him at all, set against the tough love he reserved for her son, who had every blood claim in the world. The clearest, most argued over rupture came in January 1851. Thomas Lincoln was dying. Johnston wrote asking Abraham to come. Abraham did not. His wife Mary had just given birth to their son Willie and was, by his own account, sick in bed. He wrote back instead, a letter historians still cannot agree on. Was it a genuinely difficult logistical choice, a man torn between a newborn and a 400-mile trip to a dying father? Or evidence of something colder between Abraham and Thomas specifically, a rift that never touched Sarah at all? Thomas died January 17, 1851. Abraham did not attend the funeral. This is not a mystery the film can solve, because it is not one history has solved either. What the record does show, without ambiguity, is that whatever distance sat between Abraham and his father never crossed over to Sarah. He kept visiting her. He kept the word mother attached to her name for the rest of his life. Whatever else broke in that family, the bond he built with the illiterate widow who handed him her books outlasted the one he had with the father who raised him. By 1860, Sarah Bush Lincoln was 71, running a farm in Coles County, Illinois. The census that year lists her as head of household, with a tenant family working her 40 acres. Her stepson was about to become the most consequential, and most hated, man in the country, depending entirely on which half of it you asked. On January 30 and 31, 1861, Lincoln traveled to see her before he left for Washington. He stayed the night. The next morning, before continuing on, he visited his father's grave. Neither of them could have known with certainty that this was the last time they would see each other. Something in Sarah, by every account, already suspected it. Days later, a relative wrote to Lincoln describing her state of mind as he prepared to take office. She was growing frail and, in the language of the letter itself, very uneasy about him, afraid his political opponents would kill him. This is not folklore passed down through generations of family retelling. It is a documented letter, written before the war had even started, 4 years before Booth fired a shot inside Ford's Theater. It would be dishonest to call this prophecy. Sarah had no secret knowledge of any specific conspiracy. Fear for a president's life was not an unreasonable thing to carry into 1861. The country was already splitting over secession, and Lincoln himself was smuggled through Baltimore in disguise weeks before his own inauguration, on the advice of the detective Allan Pinkerton, whose agents had uncovered a credible plot against him along his inaugural route. The threat Sarah feared was not imagined. It was already real enough that professional security men were rerouting a president-elect through the night to avoid it. Her fear was not clairvoyance. It was an old, illiterate widow watching a country tear itself apart around the boy she had raised, and trusting an instinct about exactly what that would eventually cost him. That she turned out to be right does not make her a prophet. It makes her one of the very few people close to Lincoln who said it out loud, in writing, before it happened, and was taken seriously enough that someone thought to send the warning on to him. Lincoln was shot April 14, 1865, and died the next morning. Sarah Bush Lincoln, 76, outlived him by nearly 4 years. Later that year, William Herndon, Lincoln's former law partner, already chasing down every surviving witness to reconstruct the private life of a man the country was busy turning into scripture, traveled to Coles County to interview her. She was, by his own reckoning, one of the last people alive who had known Abraham as a child instead of a myth. She told him about the bureau she had carried from Kentucky, about scrubbing 2 grieving children until they looked human again, about the books she could not read and handed over anyway, about the sermons re-preached from a stump until Thomas made him stop. She told him their minds had always seemed to run in the same channel, and she told him, weeping, by the account that survives, about the last visit, the overnight stay before Washington, the morning at his father's grave, and the fear she had carried since his election that she would never lay eyes on him again. She said she believed he and his father were together now, and that she wanted to go where they were. She died April 12, 1869, at 80, on the Coles County farm she had run largely on her own through most of 2 marriages and 1 long widowhood. She was buried beside Thomas Lincoln in Shiloh Cemetery, survived by more than 20 grandchildren. A hospital in Coles County carries her name today, the Sarah Bush Lincoln Health Center, a fittingly unglamorous monument for a woman whose entire relationship to greatness was unglamorous. Floors laid, clothes mended, books handed to a child she could not read herself, a broken household rebuilt because someone had to rebuild it, and she decided it would be her. Historians who study her life tend to arrive at the same conclusion, worded differently each time, that measured by wealth or distinction, her own biography would barely register, until you notice the one thing she did that nothing else about her needs to justify. She met a motherless boy at exactly the right moment, and helped him become Abraham Lincoln. She is not worth remembering because she predicted an assassination. She is worth remembering because for 46 years, in a life that handed her no formal power and no guarantee any of it would matter to history, she kept choosing to show up for a boy who owed her nothing, legally, biologically, or otherwise, and he called her mother for the rest of his life, right up to the last morning he ever saw her. The conditions that shaped her: frontier widowhood, remarriage as survival, a world offering no path to literacy for a woman of her station, a historical record built almost entirely from what other people remembered about her instead of anything she left behind herself, did not disappear when she died. They simply stopped being visible, the way the people who quietly hold a family together while someone else becomes famous nearly always do. Almost none of what this film has told you exists in her own handwriting. It exists because a lawyer thought to sit down across from an old, illiterate widow and write down what she said before it was too late. The same courtesy history rarely extends to women like her, and almost never extends in time. She saw an ending coming, in her own way, long before anyone else was willing to say it. She never explained how. She did not have to. She only had to be there, and for as long as it mattered, she was.